Welcome everybody to this BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG event tonight on European horror. We're delighted to have everybody here, and we've got a great panel lined up. We're missing one person at the moment who's joining us in a little while, but I'm going to hand over to our chair to do full introductions and get started. So Reece Goodall is a PhD candidate at Warwick University. Reece, what is your PhD? What are you finishing up? Remind me.
I'm studying 21st century French horror.
So very apt for this evening's topic, and thank you for organising this. Really looking forward to it. Okay, good luck everybody. Very much looking forward to this, and we'll speak to you soon.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. Thank you everyone for coming along tonight for this event, this wonderful BAFTSS Horror Studies Wednesday Night Bites in Halloween week. Hopefully we can deliver a nice horror-filled night for you tonight. So as Laura mentioned, I'm studying French horror for my PhD. And the rationale for this event is that throughout my studies, the concept of European horror has cropped up quite frequently. The sense that French horror may be part of a wider wave of European horror. And in my studies, I asked this question of what does it mean? What does European horror designate? And the answer is not perhaps as immediately apparent as it may appear. There are tons of connotations. I shan't get into this too much now, but tons of ideas, which hopefully we'll bring out in a panel discussion with some incredible experts, people who are knowledgeable about national European horror cinemas, people who literally wrote the books on European horror. Tonight we're joined by Russ Hunter from Northumbria University, Xavier Aldana Reyes and Emily Brick, both from Manchester Metropolitan University, and a little later we'll be joined by Alice Haylett Bryan from King's College London. I shan't say too much, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves when I ask my opening question, which is I'd just like to invite you guys to talk about your relationship with European horror cinema, both as a viewer and as a scholar. Would anyone like to go first? Shall I ask Russ first, if that's all right, Russ?
That's all right. Thanks, Reece, and hi everyone. Thanks for being here. I think people's interest in horror generally comes from lots of different places, but for me, I think the interest in European horror specifically comes from growing up in a very monocultural place, a very mono-ethnic place in Devon. You know, I was talking to one of my students today, and he's from Manchester. And we were talking about just, you know, school and whatever. And I pointed out to him that in my school, there were 1,500 students and only one of them wasn't white. And it's because the Southwest isn't going to be a white place. And growing up, I just felt like I wanted something different. And I was always interested in things that looked outside of that. And it kind of really interested me. And as a kid, you know, we used to go on holiday we had these, it's the 1980s, and we went on these package holidays to Spain. And this whole new world opened up to me when we started doing that, of just different places and different faces. And I think I was one of those people that always wanted to get out and see things and see different things. And I think when I started to get interested in film, it was naturally European film that I drifted to rather than, you know, it's a debate whether British film counts as European film, but, you know, films outside of the UK kind of interested me much more. When I came to be a scholar, when I came to do a PhD, I'd been working in industry for a while, and I came back into higher education in my late 20s. You have this moment when you're deciding on what PhD to do, what topic to do, where it's a bit like playing an RPG computer game where you create your character and you decide what class you're going to be and what skills you're going to have, and deciding what topic you're going to have. It's deciding kind of which route you're going to go down, which people, which tribe you're going to belong to academically. And I think it felt natural to me, already being interested in horror, that I was going to focus on European horror. You know, probably the teenage me would also probably admit that, you know, trying to watch European horror films, if they were ever on TV late at night on Channel 4, there was something where you kind of thought maybe there'd be a bit of nudity as well. You know, as a teenager, there was another kind of exoticism there. But I think academically, I got interested in it for those reasons. But actually, in terms of the academic reason itself, I think I've just been fascinated by the fact that there are so many different nations with so many different histories that's really kind of fungible. that have that, and there are so many different apparent influences on European horror cinema that for me, unpicking that, trying to work out in any nation or groups of nations, actually, are there connections or not? Are these separate things? What's influencing it? Is there a collective European identity? For me, I think that's always been the really fascinating academic part of engaging with European horror.
Thank you so much. How about yourself, Emily, if I could ask you?
Hi, thank you, Reece. I have come to it from a completely different direction. Like, we've all come actually through really different pathways. So obviously I've always loved horror, but I did my degree in early modern history and like 20th century American history. So I was studying these two things at the same time. I was doing early modern Europe and reading Thomas Le Queux at the same time as I was doing slasher films and reading Carol Clover. And the same with Barbara Creed as well. So I'm reading Barbara Creed on a horror module, but then I'm also doing a module on witches and religion and Catholicism in early modern Europe. And I'm actually reading the Malleus Maleficarum. So they've always, for me, been completely intertwined. So in terms of the kind of European bit, I come to it from a history point of view and sort of why and how that historical background shapes the culture and cinema the way that it has. And why is it different across different bits of Europe? Because obviously religion is intertwined with mythology as well, and folklore, and all of the sources of those horror materials. But then kind of when I moved on to horror and did like a master's and a PhD in film, I approached it through a kind of monster lens. And so I'm looking at different monsters and going, okay, well, these are the witches. What does it look like in France? What does it look like in Sweden? Why is that different from America? What's the origin of that difference? And that generally goes back, particularly in relation to anything religious or witchy, to that early modern period. So again, it's kind of, I've come full circle and I've come back to that actually. Now I'm doing witches again and looking at the kind of origins of witchcraft and why that's different across different national cinemas. So completely different direction to Russ, but kind of ending up at the same place. So I kind of approach it as I'll watch that film because it's got a witch in it and then look at the context that it's produced in rather than the other way around.
Thank you very much. And lastly, Xavier.
Thanks, Reece, and thank you as well to everyone who's joining us tonight. As you can probably tell from my accent, I wasn't born here. I am a child of the Erasmus exchange program. In a way, I'm Theresa May's worst nightmare. You know, I am the student who came and never left, so to speak. I would say that as someone who was always, from a very young age, interested in cultures that weren't my own, and with a particular love of British culture, I've always been an Anglophile and an Anglophone for as long as I can remember. To me, you know, a transnational frame is the way that I think. I'm also, I was completely affected by the Cool Britannia movement. You know, growing up, I was watching, remember as well that films in Spain are normally dubbed, or at least they were when I was growing up. So for a long time, I was growing up on this drop feed of horror, and I couldn't necessarily tell where it was from because it all had the same people dubbing the work. So I'd be watching an Argento, not necessarily being able to tell it apart from a Spanish horror film or from a Hammer horror film. It was only later when I started to specialize in the Gothic, and I started specializing in the British Gothic in particular, that I started thinking about the transnational aspects of borrowing, the transnational sort of moments of collaboration as well between countries, because I think to speak about European horror in a way makes sense, given that, you know, the co-production system that Europe has had for a long time means that some films that we talk about as Spanish horror, for example, really are Spanish-Italian co-productions, or, you know, thinking of people like Segundo de Chamon, who is normally talked about as the first Spanish, you know, director, but he was actually making most of his films in France and so on. So for me to think about horror history is to think transnationally and strongly to think about European horror. On a side note, before I finish, I learned my English from Hammer horrors. So when I moved to the UK, people had to correct me because I was saying things like evil, the way that Peter Cushing would do in the Hammer horrors. Anyway, that's me and my connection to European horror in a nutshell.
Fantastic. Thank you all very much. And what I hope to do now is to ask a few sort of general questions about European horror. I want to say to anyone watching, if you have any thoughts, if you have any questions or general ideas or comments about European horror, please do post in the chat as we go along. And hopefully we can bring out comments and ideas as we go along. I'd love this to be a real discussion, not just amongst us, but also amongst everyone watching. So please do post your comments and thoughts. And what I want to start, although I've sort of hinted at this sense of contemporary horror, I'd like to consider perhaps the history of European horror more widely. So there are contentions perhaps that Europe is perhaps the birthplace of horror cinema, and many arguing that perhaps the first horror film was made by Georges Méliès, a French director. So arguably the entire history of European cinema is one of horror. But it's a genre that, if we think like that, has changed and evolved quite considerably and throughout the birth of cinema at the end of the 1890s. And so what I hope to ask the panel first of all is about how the face, how what we'd consider as European horror has changed throughout cinema's life cycle. And I think it may be wise to ask Russ again, and seeing as you wrote your excellent introduction to European horror, in which you touch on many of these same questions.
I think, I mean, first of all, I think, it's the classic academic thing really of saying it's a really complex question, because I think it comes in fits and starts and in jolts. And one of the things that I think is very true of European horror history is that it's hard to bring together a clear narrative, because I think at different moments, there are different influences in different countries that bring about different kinds of horror, but sometimes they join up. And as Xavier rightly says, there are all these interconnections. But if we look, for instance, if we think about the 1920s in Germany, we think about German Expressionism, that comes from an art movement. It comes from a movement outside of cinema. It seeps into cinema. But then that's quite different, for instance, what might happen in the 1970s, say, in Italy, with what's really a form of exploitation cinema, largely where we're copying and it's really commercial and filmmakers are making 5 or 6 things a year. I think the difficulty, there's a conceptual difficulty for me, at least immediately, with European horror cinema, of trying to piece together these things into a coherent narrative. Other panelists might disagree. And I think it's interesting what you said about Méliès, because actually, I think that notion that Europe potentially is the birthplace of horror is a really interesting one. But I think it's a contentious one. And I think actually it's not typically been the way in which the history of horror cinema has been thought about, because there are those who argue that it starts in the 1930s and with universal horror, because the phrase, the generic term horror, only starts to get used in somewhere in the mid-1930s, and we're not exactly sure when, but it starts to get used then in relation to those universal horror films. So the conceptual question immediately is it at that point then we can start to talk about horror? Can we retrospectively go back and say, actually, this film looks like a horror film? And actually, I wrote a thing recently in a book called Satan on Cinema, edited by Jeffrey Weinstock and Regina Hansen, just come out if anyone wants to buy it. But I wrote a piece about exactly this thing of kind of very early examples of horror. And I think you can make a very strong case for saying it starts with somebody like Méliès, because something like The Haunted Castle has a lot of those, albeit in very big, broad brushstrokes, but a lot of those kind of Gothic tropes that we see later in horror cinema. It's there, it's kind of there already. The existence of the devil really in early European cinema, it serves lots of functions. The existence of the devil, arguably, I think is it's a reference point for evil in a narrative, and for horror in a narrative. I would say it's a way of pinning horror to a narrative. That happens really early on. But I think even films, if we broaden this to think about Britain as well, even films like The X-Ray Fiends, for example, which is a really short film where you see 2 people being X-rayed. Well, the X-ray, I think that was 1897, George Albert Smith. The X-ray had come about 2 or 3 years before that, the process of X-raying. And although it's a sort of joke thing, it's also an explanation. It's also an exploration of kind of some of the horror behind that idea of taking photographs of inside of your body. So I think in Europe there's a really good argument to say it does begin quite early on, and it can build. If we look at things like the Student of Prague, for instance. I'm really self-conscious, incidentally, about saying the Student of Prague, because my Geordie students always point out that being from Devon, I say Prague in a really weird way. But anyway, the Student of Prague, you know, arguably that's kind of maybe the first feature-length European horror, maybe, or maybe it's Inferno in Italy a couple of years before. But I think you can have a debate about where it begins. But I think there are quite a lot of reasons for just suggesting it does begin in Europe. I'll hand over to the other panelists at this point, and we can come back to it maybe. But I think the beginning is there's a good argument to say it begins in Europe, I think, but it's complicated.
Right, thank you. I take the invitation. Let's ask the other panelists. And Xavier, do you agree with Russ? Would you argue that horror begins in Europe?
I would say so, for the slightly tangential reason that, to me, the horror film begins actually further back with you know, horror fiction and, you know, the horror phantasmagoria and so on. And Europe was a main creator and main imaginer of those types of fantasies. I mean, even the work of Georges Méliès, a lot of his work were fairies, which were essentially just fairy tales, dark fairy tales, which were the ground for many Gothic stories as well. I mean, Bluebeard is one of those that has been reimagined from a horror perspective time and again. And I think that the focus on witches, on pacts with the devil, on you know, a medieval form of barbaric Europe is there already in the Gothic novel, and the Gothic novel is born in Europe. Of course, America develops its own version of the Gothic too, but to me that then filters through into the kind of visual culture that eventually becomes the first few horror films, what we might now retrospectively call the first few horror films. So yes, I wouldn't want to say that Europe was the only country that was, or the only series of countries that were making horror history or making it happen, but certainly was one of the main ones. And I would argue aesthetically the most significant one, at least initially.
Thank you very much. So as you brought in this sense of sort of the pre-cinema history of Europe, I think we could ask Emily about this. You mentioned things such as the religious aspects of European history. And it's a sense that perhaps we can think of Europe as a place of horror because of all the existing prehistory to cinema, the massive cultural stock of Europe that exists before film even came about.
Well, I think it's when you look at the origins of horror and in terms of both literature and film, and where does those stories come from? And a lot of them come from folklore. And it's like Xavier said, you know, there is a really religious framework to a lot of this myth, particularly because we have kind of the devil. It's that kind of Judeo-Christian folklore, which is intertwined with local mythology and folklore, which kind of creates monsters. You know, if you think about vampires or witches, these are monsters which are all conceived in opposition to religion. You know, you throw crucifixes at them, etc., chuck holy water on them. So they're kind of they've always been seen as other. So there's always been a kind of monstrous other presented as an opposition to religion within Europe. And then even in American horror, they don't use kind of indigenous mythology. They import a lot of that mythology from Europe. So it kind of weaves its way through. So with vampires, with witches, with werewolves, all of those kind of poverty row studios that got films that got made in the 1940s still are relying on those European folklore and mythology to create their monsters. So it's kind of hugely influential in that sense. I mean, I can't say whether it's had the same effect in other areas of the world. I mean, clearly Japanese horror kind of generates its own monsters from its own religious context. It's quite interesting actually looking at remakes across different religious boundaries. So if you think about something like The Exorcist, that's a very Catholic film, right? It's not just Christian, it's Catholic. But then there's a Turkish version of it called Satan. So it's like they take this and they translate it across to an Islamic religious framework. And so what does it look like? Looks sort of the same. I mean, it's a lot cheaper, but it's essentially very, very similar in terms of the kind of theological framework that it presents the monsters in. So yeah, all of that kind of feeds into horror films. And And like I say, particularly for me, and just the stuff that I've been doing recently, early modern is the period which feeds that, because it's that period of religious schism when those religious rules are kind of made, and Europe is then fragmented into Catholic countries and Protestant countries, which have even different aesthetics that flow through to the horror, as well as kind of slightly different religious frameworks. So the kind of emphasis on transubstantiation within Catholicism means that those countries kind of produce a very visceral, body orientated blood horror, you know, literally the eating of blood and flesh is the most kind of profane thing that you can produce within a Catholic framework. Whereas kind of the same films or the same stories, like a vampire film, Let the Right One In, doesn't look like that. You know, it has a very different kind of austere Protestant aesthetic that was developed across those countries. So it kind of really does flow through everything, from the mythology to the frameworks that the monsters sit within, to the actual aesthetics of the films themselves. You know, the inside of Catholic and Protestant churches look very different. You know, Catholic churches are red, they're full of lush things, they're full of gold. Protestant churches look more austere, they've got cooler colours. It's, you know, and it literally kind of translates across to the horror films. I mean, that obviously I'm talking in very general terms here, but I think it kind of does apply, and you can see the effects of that schism across countries through their kind of religious history and the way that that is related to the cultural output.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you. Shall I circle back to you, Russ? Do you...
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I wanted to say as well is that I think one of the reasons it's quite difficult to study European horror is because at various points it disappears in certain places. So where it might look like it's going to develop, it stops. So, you know, my own expertise is really more in Italian horror cinema. But as an example, you know, in 1921 in Italy, we get The Monster of Frankenstein. And it's a lost film. You know, we don't know much about it. We've tried to recover stuff about it. We don't know much about it. But that coincides with exactly the point at which Mussolini and the fascist Italian state take over in Italy. And horror effectively stops at that point, because cinema is not about representing anything terrible, at least in your own country. And there's a sort of block on that, because the encouragement of what you do in cinema at that point is to direct resources at things that are suggesting that your own nation is doing tremendously and fabulously well. Thank you very much. So it stops there. But, you know, there's a historian called Mark Mazower who wrote a book called The Dark Continent about Europe, and this suggestion that, and it's about the 20th century in Europe, and the suggestion is, you know, there's a lot of stuff that happens in the 20th century in terms of communism, fascism, totalitarian regimes in various places. That in our case, if we start to look at them, what that might mean for cinema, for cinema, that starts to mean it stops. So in communist Eastern Europe, for instance, it's very difficult to find examples of horror during certain periods of communist rule. Certainly in Italy, as I said, it stops, and it doesn't really come back again until 1957. So you have this huge gap in Italy where you think something might happen, it stops dead. And I think those aspects of European history, particularly those totalitarian aspects in the 20th century, cause these juncture points in terms of development and how horror develops across Europe. And I think that really kind of complicates the picture quite a lot, and it makes it very difficult to create narratives, because you have precisely these different trends at different points. So I said you have German expressionism, but, you know, for various reasons that stops. A lot of the people who make it go to America, actually, and then you have that influence somewhere else. But we have this stop-start quality, I think, to horror cinema. Now, I think, you know, when you get to the post-1957 period in sort of Britain and in Italy in particular, you start to get an acceleration then of horror. It starts to come back. And it's not to say there aren't any examples in between, but that period in between, I think, is quite a fallow period compared to what then happens much, much later. I don't know how the other panelists feel about that.
Xavier?
I totally agree with Russ. I think that's a very, very good observation, and it certainly applies to the cinema of Spain for many reasons, because what actually I find fascinating is the fact that any horror was made really prior to 1975, and it's actually a testament to the fact that an industry was growing in the 60s and 70s that happened. But what's interesting about that context as well is that then that national cinema is actually made for abroad. So that's another element that we need to bring into the conversation, that a lot of the national cinemas that we will be discussing today are actually made for foreign eyes, so to speak, and they often reproduce foreign formulas. It's been said of Spanish horror that it's apátrida, not national, not Spanish, right? Because it has historically tried to look un-Spanish and so on. Now, that's only one version of the story, and it's one, pre-21st century version of the story. But it's absolutely the case that, had Spain not been under a military dictatorship for 40 years, we would have seen a very different history of Spanish horror. People like Alfonso Sastre, who were very keen to develop a form of the Gothic that was very political, were absolutely lambasted and censored and everything. So yeah, whatever horror comes out of Spain in that period does so against the grain. Yeah.
Thank you. So Emily, do you want to add anything on to that?
Yeah, well, yeah, actually, just in terms of, I think one of the reasons that you get that stop-starting as well, obviously there's a kind of industrial slant to it as well, but horror is, a place where traditionally trauma is processed. So it's kind of not surprising that you get these bursts all over Europe in response to kind of oppressive regimes, to wars, to fascism, to all of those things. And again, it's interesting to look at how those countries all process stuff differently, right? So a Serbian film is very different to Pan's Labyrinth. They kind of generate a very different vision of war and how it's processed. I mean, obviously with an American horror as well, but there's a whole lot more internal wars going on in Europe than there is in American cinema. So it's never kind of developed that one coherent political ideology in a way that American cinema does, because there's all of this fragmentation all the time.
I think as well, just to circle back to Xavier's point, what you see in Italy with genre cinema in the 1960s and 70s is people use pseudonyms, and one of the explanations for that is that Italians didn't buy into the fact, for instance, that Italians could make spaghetti westerns, that they just wouldn't be very good at it, and that what you wanted was authenticity, and that would be something American, and that transferred over into Italian horror cinema, and maybe more as well. That's not really even so much about the domestic market, but it's also about you're trying to export it. And if you want the US market, you want someone in the US to go and see your film, you don't want to be called Sergio Martino. You want to be called something else. You want a name that sounds like you're the kind of name that we associate with directors of horror cinema. And so that happens. I think that process happens where you do get this outward focus, and export markets were incredibly important for Italian horror cinema, particularly in the 1970s, which is why you also start to get in the 70s in Italy, for instance, lots of films that are set in the US as well. So that not only do they have actors and directors with pseudonyms, but you get places that look a bit more authentic, that look a bit more like they're going to be the US. So I think there is that. The pseudonym thing is it cuts across, certainly in Italy and as Xavier said, Spain. I don't know other contexts, but certainly in those two contexts.
Thank you very much for that. I can build on your comments there, Russ, to pose another question to the panel. They're talking about how these films were perhaps built to look more American at this point. And I said the overall question of this panel is, what's European about European horror? I suppose the question I want to ask is, thinking about Europe, we're talking about 44 different countries, and we're talking about 6 other interlopers that are partially in Europe. And if we look for sort of similarities between these films, so we're sort of looking for similarities between so many different cultures, so many different film cultures, and what I wonder is, it may be an impossible question, it may not even be a useful question, but can we sort of identify similarities or similar thematic concerns or similar aesthetic concerns between European horror films? It's a very heavy question.
I'm quite happy to start off. I mean, thinking about contemporary works in particular, And I think in 21st century European horror, the question of immigration comes up a lot. I know obviously in French horror, but in Spanish horror too, if we think of films like Rec, whether they are, approach immigration from a stance that is very wary of the foreign other, whether that's a sort of Eastern European other or an other from outside of Europe, depending obviously usually on the colonial history of the country in question, or whether alternatively some films are far more fearful of the rise of the far right within Europe. So though I do feel overall it's very hard to kind of pick or see European horror as a cohesive whole, it's undeniable that, there are always going to be these kind of commonalities between them, reacting to particular fears or anxieties of any particular moment.
Thank you very much, Alice. I wonder, it may be worth posing the question, thinking about this as well, is what we mean by Europe. This is a question that, particularly in the introduction of Emily's book, European Nightmares, crops up the sense of how we understand European horror being complicated by how we understand Europe itself. I wonder if I could ask you, Emily, a little about that.
This is the difference again between, I think, Europe and America, is it's been in this constant state of flux. The borders have been changing constantly over the last century. And so obviously you can kind of see that in the fragmented nature of horror. There's crossovers, like Xavier said, a lot of these films are cross company, kind of cross production. I like Peter Hutchinson's definition when he sort of talks about it as there is no coherence to it, that's its attraction. But at the same time, I think if we all were asked, what does a European horror film look like, we would all have an idea of what that means. Just to go back a little bit to the aesthetics question. So I think there's a legacy of European horror, particularly across the 60s and 70s, that we can all recognize as being distinctly European. So as an example, I saw a film the other week called Two Witches. I don't know if anyone's seen it. It was at Grimfest. I'll just show you the. So that's the kind of still image from it, but it's sold as a European film, right? As a generic 70s European film. And so once we kind of have a thing that we recognize, obviously the Love Witch did it as well. And it does look like that, it's very recognizably using that kind of campy, lots of gore and blood, schlocky horror. But at the same time, it's still an American film. And I met the directors afterwards and I said, do you think this is a European film? And they, the director and the producer, and they're both French, and they went, well, we're European, so yes, it is. And that's what we wanted it to look for, and what we wanted it to look like. So there's a definite kind of sensibility of it as well. But then obviously, like Russ said, it changes so much over time, so we get all of these different waves happening. So a kind of gritty British horror film looks very different to that. But yet we would both still recognize that as quite a distinctly European aesthetic that you wouldn't necessarily find in other different areas of the world. So I think it's contradictory because it's united and yet it's fragmented at the same time. It's both of those things together. And that kind of fragmentedness could even be a sense, there are commonalities of kind of sensibility or kind of approach that we all recognize as being European, even if we can't quite articulate exactly what that means. But yeah, we had, in terms of kind of categorizing and how we broke down European horror in that book, I'll just kind of explain how we put it together. It came from a conference. So it was quite a big conference. And then the book was an edited collection of the papers in it. So it wasn't, we kind of gave a brief going explore European horror. And although we said that we were going to do that in the introduction, like I think one of the reviews said they don't really succeed, which I think is a fair enough comment because it was never really going to do that. That wasn't the brief. And so we grouped them together in terms of kind of location rather than anything else. We could have done it thematically. But when you say to someone, do a European thing, they focus on the nationality of it. And it's kind of always foregrounded because, kind of rather than going, well, zombie horror, because you're putting national identity or European identity in the title of it, that's kind of what people focus on. So that's what we had, and we kind of arranged them into the most logical geographical areas, really.
Yeah, thank you very much. Russ, you look like you want to.
Yeah, it's my thinking face. I think what's interesting, actually, building on what Emily said, is if you look at how people outside of Europe view European horror is quite interesting. So in Ian Olney's book, for instance, he uses the term Euro horror. And that term Euro horror in the States, at least to how I've mostly understood it coming from the States, has tended to really refer to the trashier elements of Europe. So the case study he has at the start of that is Trolls 2, I think. Yeah, Troll 2, sorry. It's Troll 2. And that's a really particular example of a kind of European horror film, of a really visceral, not that well made, you know, slightly comedic horror film, not intentionally. So I think how it's perceived from the outside is quite interesting. If you see actually how do people on the outside perceive it, and one of the ways it's perceived is through this term Euro horror. Now, whether the term Euro horror means something different from European horror is a different question. But there's another label that's used. There's this Euro horror label that's used, which at least in the way I've seen it used, has tended to refer to a very specific kind of European horror cinema. And I think it's difficult, and I think Emily's right. I think there are several different types of European horror cinema, and we don't yet have a kind of taxonomy of them, and maybe that's something where scholarship needs to go, is to start to think about that. But I think thinking of a European identity is difficult, because you do have all of those nation states, and as you said, all of those states that are around that are kind of in Europe and kind of aren't as well, and people are naturally then focused on an individual area to study. But I also think it's partly because it's really difficult, practically speaking, to study the whole thing. I want to be a bit, apologies if it's a bit in self-indulgent this, but you know, I was for a long time, and I think it's probably still advertised somewhere, I was going to write in an introduction to European horror cinema, but I actually didn't do it. I'm doing something else now because it proved too difficult. It proved too complicated. On a practical level, it proved too complicated, because trying to understand European horror as an individual who might speak one or two languages, but certainly doesn't speak all of them, and can't access the archives, and more importantly, can't access the cultural references and understandings that you need in individual countries to understand them, means that it's really difficult, I think, for individuals at least, to try and draw together a sense of what European means. Partly the problem I had was exactly trying to draw together all these different traditions, but also trying to draw together all of these different nations and thinking, well, I don't know anything about, you know, Hungarian horror. I might know a bit about Italian horror, but I don't know much about Russian horror, and that's the difficulty. And I think what we've tended to do is focus on Western European horror in particular. That's where and that might be because that's where the biggest production's been. You know, in Italian cinema in the 70s, they were making nearly 300 films a year at one point. Not all of those were horror films, but they were genre films, and there were a lot of horror films. But I think that's where our focus has tended to be, for whatever reasons. That's made it complicated. That makes it and has made it complicated to think about Europe, I think. There's a conceptual and practical difficulty in getting at that, I think.
Interesting. Yeah, Xavier.
I also think that there's been a shift in the last 20 years as we have become more aware that that big thing, the 60s and 70s European horror, that sort of catch-all category for anything that wasn't US horror. As we've started looking at that through different eyes, through the eyes of auteurism in particular, I feel there's been sort of like a push away from, you know, understanding European holistically. So, you know, there are now plenty of studies on directors that would have been called, you know, not general, but low budget directors like Jess Franco or Mario Bava has been completely rethought in the last 20 years. Lucio Fulci, all these people that, you know, you can now find truly insightful studies of their work as auteurs rather than as European directors. So I think we've also shifted our perception in terms of how we consume and study that work, that body of work that's European horror.
Thank you all very much. there's an interesting comment from Jason in the chat, saying that when Euro horror has been dubbed into English, the original language stuff has been essentially stripped entirely from the equation. Sort of the Europeanness perhaps of it is purged to make it consumable for our audience, and which is the pain of dubbing even still now, I suppose. I want to ask Emily.
Well, I was just going to make a point about that, actually, because I think it's quite interesting looking at the way that it develops in relation to the development of technology. So there's a massive shift, like as I said, about 20 years ago, kind of in scholarship, but also in distribution. So kind of across right up to a certain point, if you wanted to get hold of an obscure horror film, you had to get it, a hard copy of it from a video shop. Lots, you know, different countries in Europe have very different censorship laws as well. So there's a lot of issues in terms of distribution. You know, you get films made in countries that are distributed throughout Europe, but not in the country that they're actually made, because of, you know, they don't pass their own country's censorship laws. But then technology starts to change all of that. So we're past the days when I would like buy horror videos from like the dodgy sweet shop man, you know, under the counter, because, and at that point there was a kind of cachet involved in seeing stuff that no one had got hold of, right? You know, there was a kind of collecting, you know, thing within horror fandom as well. And then when it becomes easier to distribute stuff online and everything goes digital, that makes a huge difference. And then also you can subtitle stuff that had never been subtitled before very, very easily, which then makes it accessible to different audiences. And, you know, so you don't necessarily need that dubbing anymore. But I think what's quite interesting is that I've watched quite a few things on Netflix recently that are dubbed. And it's like it's come back. So Netflix are now making kind of one version. I can't remember what it's called. It's like there's a police drama. There's one of the episodes has got David Tennant in it, but it's made like in 3 different countries. So I've watched like French ones and they're all dubbed. So they're all kind of telling the same story. It's set in a police cell and they're dubbed again. And I'm like, I never thought that would come back, but it has. And so that technology has changed the distribution and reception of, you know, kind of what would have been minority cinemas before and opened it up hugely. You know, it doesn't, that distribution model has changed the way that cinema is made.
Thank you very much. I think you're right. And talking about that, it leads me on to what I think is going to be my final question in order to open it up to the audience and the chat. I'm talking about how the sort of the mediascape has changed, that people have more access to foreign films than ever before, but also perhaps it has changed the sort of the whole concept of national cinema, perhaps even of continental cinemas. And I want to ask you all the question about whether, given that sort of a global audience is familiar with the horror genre, with tropes of the horror genre, and the fact that European horror, I think we can say, is clearly in dialogue with, it has a relationship with other national and other regional, perhaps even continental horror cinemas, and whether the whole sense of trying to define a label of European horror, whether that's a useful or particularly relevant endeavour in the sort of 21st century mediascape. I know, I apologize, I'm going a very abstract question, but I'd be curious for your guys' opinion after we've debated the merits of European horror. Should we be, is really my question. Is it still a useful idea?
I guess the question then is, was it ever a useful idea? And you know, that's the other thing as well, is it's not just sort of where we are now and is it useful, but it's actually, could we look back and say, has it been a useful term to explain all of those things? And actually, maybe it has at some points, but I think the interconnections tend to be between countries that are quite close to each other culturally, economically, or geographically. And if you look at film festivals, genre film festivals at the moment, that's the best place to go to see what's the state of European horror cinema. And what you find is, you know, for instance, Celluloid Screams, which is just finished, great film festival in Sheffield. They had several French-Belgian co-production horror films or genre films. a lot of, when you look at festivals, if you will see that, you'll see clumping together of, it will be a Serbian, Montenegrin, Slovenian co-production. So I think in a way what might be more useful, but there's work that needs to be done here, which is to actually look at who does have co-productions with who in European horror cinema. My sense would be it is people who are working together generally that have some cultural or geographical connection, because it's, you know, it's quite difficult. I was thinking when Emily was talking just now that one of the difficulties is I remembered a film, I was trying to remember the name of it. There's I think it's a Polish film called The Lure, which is on, or Lure, which is on Netflix. It's to me, watching it as an English person watching that film, it made no sense to me. It was completely bonkers, right? Now it might be that a Polish person makes more sense of that, or somebody from Eastern Europe can make more sense of that. And there are reference points that I don't understand, but it looked like a very local film that would make sense to you perhaps more if you're from Poland or if you're from that area. That's really different. It's a mermaid-based film, which is really different from Nymph, which is a mermaid-based film, which is I think Serbian, Montenegrin, and actually Polish co-production, but it's really more a Serbian, Montenegrin film. They are completely different films. You know, Nymph has this set by the seaside, glamorous, good-looking people, whereas The Lure has got a much more seedier, down at heel, life is rough kind of quality to it. If you looked at those two films, and maybe it's unfair to just take two random films, but they're both mermaid films, both completely different. Really, it's really hard to make a sense of an argument for the Europeanness of them, other than perhaps they're co-productions, and there's a tendency in Europe to have co-productions. So I think it is difficult. I think it's quite a complicated thing to unpack, I think.
So thank you very much, Russ. Alice.
Yeah, I mean, I do agree with you, Russ, but I think there's also, we can't always draw too much into co-productions because filmmakers will go where the money is. And obviously in horror and across European cinema as a whole, we have the whole Euro pudding, the idea that filmmakers will quite often take, you know, money where they can. So though I do agree with you in some sense, and it can be interesting to see when certain patterns start to repeat themselves, such as like French-Belgian relationships, that sort of thing, we also then have to think, always be aware that there's kind of, you know, desperate money grabs often going on.
Oh, absolutely. I think one of the things that's interesting in that respect as well is if you look at structural funds and regional funds, that's one of the reasons I think often you get co-productions as well between countries that might geographically be close, because they might be part of other arrangements that mean it's much easier for them to access regional funding. And a lot of European films have done that. You know, there's rather structural funds from, you know, the Westphalia region in Germany, for instance, has a structural fund. And actually Creep's really interesting in that sense. It's a bit of an old film now, but is it 2002, I think? But maybe Creep is a good example of a film where you can see a Europeanness, because that's a German-English co-production. It's set in London. It's set, you know, on the tube, but the lead is German. But actually in London, that makes sense, that this really metropolitan city, that so in a sense that the mixture there, which might seem quite odd in other contexts, if you had, you know, a horror film set in rural Devon and the lead actress was German, it would be weird because it wouldn't connect. It would seem strange. In London, that makes perfect sense, and that film's a kind of, I think, a good example of something where we can say there are lots of European connections. It seems very European, but I think there are lots of films where you sit them side by side, that films of similar genres, when you start to compare, it becomes quite complicated. But you're right. I mean, filmmakers will go absolutely where the money is. But I think what it points to is there's a lot more work to be done, and I think there's less work to be done maybe now on individual films. And as Abby said, there's been a whole big change on looking at European horror auteurs, and we've done a lot of work on that, and it's been really great that we've changed the way we think about a lot of directors. People like Sergio Martino are now getting a lot of love academically, actually. People, I think, understanding that these were people who were actually sometimes were quite good filmmakers, or were doing innovative things, but maybe we now need to shift a little bit in how we're looking at stuff, and maybe that broader focus is useful now.
Thank you very much. If I can just say a comment in the chat about Creep from Mary. She worked at the UK sales agency that substantially funded the film. They had a lot of other monies from Germany off the back of Franco Potenti's involvement. So it does link to this point you say about the money.
Yeah, I think I think the post-production was done in Germany. I talked to the producer, I can't remember her name now, but they did the post-production, I think I'm right in saying, in Germany on that. And yeah, so it's absolutely, so there's and because that money's, that's why Franca Potente was the lead actress, you know, and some other actors were obviously connected to it who weren't British. Thank you, Mary. Thank you.
Xavier.
I wanted to sort of add that I think where it still makes sense to talk about European horror is where audiences come into the picture, because I think that what has traditionally defined this type of national cinema, and maybe this is not, maybe British people are not as aware of that because they have always made film that is automatically more exportable than national cinemas elsewhere, because well, you've got the issue of the language to begin with. So I'm thinking of like in the context of Spain or Italy, there were normally traditionally two possible markets, the national one or the international one, with some films, you know, being able to tap into two. So, you know, I'm thinking, for example, I think in Italy they call them filoni, right? The sort of attempt to cash in quickly on trends. There were normally, at least in the Spanish context, I'm thinking, for example, post-Scream, there was a rise of neo-slashers very much made for the national context. That's very different from like a film like Pan's Labyrinth that was very explicitly aiming for an international audience, or from even the work of Jaume Balagueró in Darkness, which is a film that ostensibly looks, you know, everything but Spanish, or the others. You know, it's interesting that those films that have resonated, at least in the Spanish context, have been films that have been made with an eye to foreign markets. But it's that notion of the audience, of either making films for a national audience or an international audience, that for me defines and brings together different types of European horror, because these films are not made in the same way that the US films or even British films are made, because they cannot tap automatically into all those other markets. So to bring us a positive spin into the age of digital streaming that Emily was mentioning before, there has been an interesting side effect on that, and that's that you are much more likely to watch regional horror now there than you would have done 15 years ago. I've got one of my students looking at Basque cinema in particular, and it's amazing the amount of films, not just that have been made in the Basque country, but that are actually in Basque, which is unthinkable. You know, only 30 years ago, you would just not have found distribution or dissemination for that particular film other than locally, and I'm talking in the region. So that's fascinating. You know, whether they're dubbed or subtitled, I think that sudden access to all of that cinema is both really exciting and also quite daunting, because there's suddenly just so much cinema to watch. So that's where I find the European horror label still useful myself.
So that's really interesting. I may have to check some of these out. Mrs. Goodall is a Spanish speaker from the area, so I'm sure she can enlighten me on some of these films. I ask, and Emily, if I could ask you to weigh in, is Europeanness a useful tool still, a useful label?
I think it absolutely is, and I think that it's basically an umbrella term, isn't it, that kind of refers to a body of work, and it's probably most useful in terms of marketing it to an audience outside of Europe. Within Europe, they'll be marketed within the national cinemas, and it's kind of, we saw the same thing happen with Asian horror as well. So we had all of those different national cinemas come together to be marketed or branded under the label of Asia Extreme, which is a general term, but we all know what it means, right? And we recognize that although there are different countries within that which have slightly different horror cinemas and different aesthetics, etc., we recognize that there's a certain commonality to them. And I think the same is true in Europe, is that, again, it's that kind of, we recognize the difference within the sameness. That makes sense. But I think Asia Extreme is the kind of the only other equivalent that I can think of a term which kind of has that cohesiveness to it.
Thank you. I like that difference in the sameness. It's a fantastic concept to think about European horror. Thank you all for answering my questions. Sadly, I sent them an awful lot in advance, and I apologise to them. Perhaps you had a look at them and we didn't get time to get to them. But I'd love to bring on the questions in the chat. We've had some dribbling in throughout the discussion, And if you have any more thoughts, please do drop a line in the chat. And I'd like to start with a Craig's question. He builds on your comment, Xavier, about being an Anglophile, and asks to what extent we can or we do think of British horror as European horror, and especially post-Brexit. That's, and seeing as I suppose I should ask you first, Xavier, seeing as it is building on your comment. Should we think of British as European horror?
Well, I do necessarily, because I think of the UK as part of Europe. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. And to me, I feel like that is how I always saw the UK, and that's how I wish to continue to see the UK. But in a less facetious way, I do think that there are elements that are trickling through in terms of there are the problem, of course, that we've had is that COVID has taken over. So I think the reaction to Brexit might be slower to come through. But a film like The Ritual strikes me very much as tapping onto some of these. If I'm not misremembering, there is a point in the film where they take a selfie and they go 1, 2, 3 Brexit, right? And that film is all about the European other. I was discussing this with Emily earlier today, but I didn't know this necessarily, but the film wasn't actually filmed in Sweden. It was filmed in Romania. Is that right, Emily?
Yeah, Romania.
Yeah. So that tells you something, doesn't it? And it very much is a film about not being able to be in a place where you don't understand how things work, where you feel foreign yourself, but also importantly, where you're casting that foreignness outwards. So that to me is a good example of it. But I was watching No Time to Die, not really a horror film, and thinking again, every single James Bond baddie seems to be a deformed European for whom the external evil seems to match the internal one. So yeah, I don't think maybe we haven't evolved that much really from the times of Fleming in terms of our construction of the invasive European other.
Thank you very much. Would anyone else on the panel like to weigh in?
I was going to say, I think that there is a particular sensibility within a lot of British horror, which is grounded in landscape and folk horror, and the fact that we are kind of a petty-minded island nation that doesn't like strangers, right? And that kind of like feeds into the kind of rural horror, that sort of sense of the uncanniness and the strange. That's anything, obviously, I mean, it's us in that situation, but I think just because of the language issue as well, like a lot of kind of British viewers have much more of an affinity with America just because of the language. And so that European horror says foreign language. If you think again about how films used to be categorized, kind of all foreign films, whether they're horror or anything else, would be categorized in the same category, like, foreign cinema within the video shop, which I know don't exist anymore. But, I mean, it's kind of that sense of categorization within the UK. I mean, obviously, I don't know how French people see Belgian horror, whether they see that as other, but I think that there is a particular aesthetic or sensibility within British horror that has that kind of, we're an island and we're not quite part of everything else.
I'm going to sort of leap about in the chat, but I will get to your questions, I promise. But as you mentioned, folk horror, we had a question from Christina. She asked about European folk horror. She says, quote, folk horror is a subgenre closely related to British culture, but we can find folk horror in the rest of Europe very early. She's thinking about a film called Il Demonio by Brunello Rondi. Do you think that European, or particularly Italian, folk horror has some features which we can define it as it was done with British folk horror?
I'm just trying to think of many sort of examples that I'm trying to think of what comes to mind there. I think there are similarities there are maybe broader things in Italian horror where you think about rural issues perhaps, but folk horror, so the rural giallo, for instance, I know that Austin Fisher's here tonight who's written on that. There's maybe connected issues there, but I can't think of in quite in the same way. I don't know what other panelists think, but I can't quite think that there's a corpus in the way that there might be particularly in Britain? I'm just trying to think.
I think if I can say, I know Alice is a French horror expert, as allegedly am I. I'm thinking that this sense of the rural crops up in a lot of French horror films, as something like a Shaitan or
yeah, I mean, I would say the rural crops up, but I don't know whether I'd necessarily class them as folk horror, because it's far more about, you know, city dwellers kind of, you get the certain theme of like city dwellers coming out of the city and entering into this sort of hellscape. But I don't know whether I'd necessarily, I don't know. For me, it feels like it's slightly different to what I might associate with the folk horror of Britain, for example. I don't know if any of the other panels, you know, kind of having seen these films, because I mean, maybe there are points of similarity there. I don't know. What do you think, Reece, as like fellow French horror aficionado?
Trying to get back at me. I think I'll be honest with you that my sort of knowledge of folk horror is sort of limited to The Wicker Man and did anyone watch The Third Day? And not a horror film, but sort of a series on like Sky Atlantic or something. With Jude Law. It's weird as anything. But it draws on that same tradition of sort of folk horror. And like The Wicker Man, it's set on an island. It's very distinct, you know, this is our culture and we don't like outsiders, and the main character, it turns out, has to assimilate or he's going to be executed. Again, I think that those shows, and like in the French rural things as well, it is a sense of very much the local against what the global. And these people are normally foreigners or city dwellers or something. And perhaps we could say the commonality is about identity, maybe, that these folk horrors or rural films, perhaps. I think I agree with you that the label doesn't apply perhaps as equally as we may hope, but they do seem to be about sort of specifically national, local identities, sort of really articulating themselves against some form of interloper or that represents otherness.
I suppose maybe in the French example, what you don't get in those rural, you know, kind of that rural population, there isn't necessarily a sense of history that you might get in other forms of folk horror. So they're very much people struggling to make a living in the countryside rather than people within a particular, I don't know, religion or particular belief system. So, you know, obviously, again, like just thinking about in relation to classic examples of British folk horror, it feels slightly different because it's not based in a kind of a sense of past and a sense of community, a sense of history for these rural people, but instead just the struggle of their daily lives, which then has somehow led them into usually becoming cannibals or incestuous or all those sorts of things.
Question. Thank you very much, Christina. We have a question from Jonathan in the chat. Do you want to come on camera, like you say? Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot there. But a question for all the panel.
Thank you very much, Reece. Thank you to everyone on the panel. It's a great discussion. Especially I was covering some of these European cycles of horror films recently in some of my lessons at Greenwich. Apologies also in advance. So I wrote this down, put it in the chat. It seems a bit rambling now. Typical academic question. I'll try to run through it quickly. Recently, in relation to France, Belgium, and other Western European countries, extreme has arisen as a label for certain recent cycles, as it often does now every now and again. And Emily's already mentioned Asia extreme as a comparison. Often this relates to gore and violence and other boundaries being pushed. How significant is this as a part of views of mainland European horror cinema, which is often, we perhaps notice this more over here in the UK, it's often othered or exoticized from British horror cinema and other nations, again, for reasons that Emily has often mentioned, maybe just as foreign language cinema. Or put another way, is European horror cinema often seen as distinct due to its violent content and transgression? And if there are comparable British horror cycles, in terms of violence and extremity, which I am overlooking, please do correct me.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I don't know, would anyone care to, does anyone have any thoughts?
I mean, I would quite, because I do find, especially doing French sort of contemporary horror, there is often the desire, or I find that, you know, there's a school of thought that very much associates films such as Inside, such as Frontiers, with sort of the new French extremity or European extreme cinema. For me personally, I find that a bit problematic, because I think that it completely then ignores the kind of the heritage of those films as being genre films, as being inspired by, if you speak, you know, read interviews with Bostillo and Mori, for example, with Inside, they're inspired by 1970s slashers. They're not coming at it from the same sort of background as someone like Noé or Dumont or those sorts of people. It's a very like horror heritage. And I find that sometimes classing these things as extreme, as a categorization, can be problematic, because it kind of refuses all that specifically horror-based history. It also kind of ignores the fact that, you know, to make a horror film in France is incredibly difficult. But, you know, maybe things have improved slightly in literally the last couple of years, but even as recently as Revenge, you know, Coralie Farge said it's impossible to get money for a horror film in France. You have to do, you know, that sort of Euro pudding. You have to look to America. You have to look to other sources for money. So, yeah, I have a bit of personal beef with kind of classifying French horror as extreme or relating it too much to the new French extremity, for example, because it kind of just removes all of that. So, yeah, that's one thing I think in relation to the French context. But obviously, I know that other people do that. So there's always going to be a differing of opinion.
Thanks, Alice, for reminding me of that. I think I remember now Julia DeCurno mentioning that on one of the extras I've got on the Raw Blu-ray. She says exactly that same thing, that it's very difficult to get funding for a horror film.
I think there's also the fact that a few directors, I'm thinking of Lars von Trier, I'm thinking of Michael Haneke, definitely caught that controversy as a marketing tool. So because the expectation is that if it's European, it will be exotic, probably a little bit rude, sexy, violent, that people who very much have built careers on that type of cinema use that as a marketing tool, and then that obviously in time reinforces the belief that that European cinema is like that. I think what we are starting to see is that very different directors do different things, and not just with their cinema traditions, but with what they're trying to do cinema-wise. And I think, I don't know, I'm thinking in the Spanish context, someone like Alex de la Iglesia is very different from someone like Paco Plaza, very different from you know, many other directors who are doing different things with horror, who might not necessarily be marketing their work to the same audiences that someone like Lars von Trier or Michael Haneke are. So yeah, I think it's definitely a myth with some truth to it that some people exploit as well for further commercial gain.
Emily.
I was going to say that just make the point again that different kind of continents have different censorship laws about what you can and can't show. And then part of that explosion of extreme cinema, like kind of post 2000, is that opening up of technology and the ability, not just in terms of distribution, but making films as well. So, you know, all of a sudden everything goes digital, cameras become lighter, you don't need to send out film copies, you can have digital copies. And so it opens it up a lot more. And I don't think you would have, there's a bleakness to it as well, if there's a kind of extreme aesthetic that holds it all together. And this is what I found when I looked at Base Noir, right? So we get kind of all of these rape revenge films that are really triumphant, and you know, she's yay at the end of it and she's killed them all, and at the end of Base Noir they just die and then everyone shrugs, and it's kind of just, there's a kind of bleakness to it which I don't think is just attached to the level of violence, but I think that the same thing you get in Funny Games and those kind of again, there's just a bleakness and a kind of that you don't get at all in American cinema. Even if everyone dies at the end, there's still kind of, it doesn't have that sort of existential crisis about itself at the end, where just everything's just, I think that's very much a characteristic of European cinema, but particularly that wave of it as well. It's like, we're just going to kill everyone at the end and that's it, because hey, that's how it is. So again, Serbian film, I can't see it being made in the 70s in the way that it was. You know, it is a reflection of that shift in technology in terms of film production and distribution, and the lightening of censorship laws as well, because, you know, once the internet happened, you can't censor anything anymore. It's just, you can distribute whatever you like. And so again, just the torture porn wave that we had in America, which kind of paralleled it. Again, they all escaped at the end. They might have suffered on the way, but they still escape at the end. And whereas the European ones just didn't really. So I think there's a difference in kind of the politics of the endings of the films as well.
I mean, I think there's a difference too in, again, it goes back to this taxonomy of European horror cinema, because if you take a film like Troll Hunter, for instance, Troll Hunter has some disgusting slime in it, but it's not a visceral, bloody, disgusting horror film, really. And I think there are quite a lot of European horror, certainly historically, there are lots of films that are not gory or hugely visceral. It might be that at this moment in time there's more of that, but I think there is a danger in seeing everything through that lens at the moment, when actually there's a lot of stuff being made that just isn't like that as well. So I think we need to be careful that what we're not doing is having maybe a more reductive label of saying it's all quite visceral and that's what European horror is now, because there are lots of films that aren't like that as well. So it's again, it goes back to this issue of this whole complication we've had throughout this whole discussion of, you know, what is Europe, what's European horror cinema. It's a lot of different things to a lot of different people at a lot of different times, and that's maybe that maybe adds a complication behind trying to think through an issue like this, I think.
Really interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you indeed.
It's perhaps worth mentioning, just because you mentioned the Ian Olney quote earlier, Russ, and that he is one of these thinkers who I wrote this down thinking it'd be interesting. That he describes European horror simply as something that pushes the envelope in regards to sex and violence, which as you say, is not all European horror by any means. You
know, I think 13-year-old me would have been very excited by that idea, but I think, you know, in terms of the kind of thing that maybe I would have been looking for Euro horror and European horror and what that meant, but I think there's more to it. And it's not a criticism of Ian and his work, but I think it's a particular perception of what European horror means and what the term Euro horror specifically means. And I think that aspect of it, the sort of more violent, sexier aspect, is just one aspect of it that adds a certain exoticism, perhaps from the outside. Perhaps that's you know, part of what it looks like. And maybe as well, you know, the other thing I think to remember is people looking from the outside don't see always the distinctions we see as people who grew up in Europe between different nations, different languages, different cultures. You know, sometimes that, for instance, you know, I've got American friends who might not know the difference between, say, Welsh and English, or you know, what are the differences between those two countries, and they get amalgamated into one. But that, I mean, that even happens in Europe too. So I think that maybe there's also an issue of distinctiveness gets lost from a distance. And so those accounts that maybe look in one sense, it's great that someone looks in and gives a different perspective, but actually maybe we then lose exactly the kind of discussions we've had here, which is about, you know, the detail and being able to separate out different periods and different kinds and styles of European horror. I go back to what I said earlier. I think there's still a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of stuff that's being written about horror cinema now, but I think there's a lot of stuff to be done on European horror cinema that we just haven't touched yet.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant observation. As we've sort of demonstrated tonight, there's an awful lot that we still need to ask, I think. And we have a question from Noel, who I think, would you like to come on camera as well, Noel?
Yeah, happy to, yeah. So yes, Emily's touched on some of these points a little bit, but I've always been very interested in how technology changes the distribution landscape, and also people's relationship with different genre as well. I think obviously porn is known for the biggest in that regard, but I think horror is certainly a close second, and has been in the past, particularly in the 1980s. So So my question was around, obviously I grew up in the 1980s and like many people fell in love with horror because of VHS. And I'd always been kind of fascinated by the idea that to mainstream audiences, it always kind of felt like European horror sort of didn't exist before that to a degree. So that sort of demand for horror content, if you like, content, not a word I'm crazy about, but sort of came from Hollywood being scared of home video and the UK just not having an industry to fulfill it. So I was wondering if the panel had any thoughts on that idea that obviously kids like me coming home from the video store with things like Deep Red and City of the Living Dead and Demons and stuff like that, do we still feel that names like, I mean, I recognize that we're talking primarily Italian horror here, but you know, names like Argento and Fulci and Bava, would they have broken through in the same way without that sort of hunger for just pure material to get out there on home video?
I mean, just quickly on that one thing, that when I did my PhD, I looked at film reviews of Argento's work in England from the very first film until the early 2000s. What was interesting was that the term giallo, for instance, isn't used. And there's one reviewer, I can't remember who it is now, who basically says, oh, look, there's this weird term giallo that gets used about these films. I don't really know what it is or what these films are, but oh, isn't it weird? But those films, a lot of those films didn't get distributed. I think Deep Red, had a very limited distribution in London from memory. And I think pre-video access was difficult, but even with video access was difficult. You know, for me growing up, my actually akin to what Emily said earlier, I think it was our greengrocer or newsagent, I can't remember, who had a small selection of videos, but it was RoboCop and it was Platoon, and those were the things they had, and actually it was sort of hidden. Even in the video age, it was hidden, because that point in time where you're young and you're interacting with horror. For me, what I first watched were Hammer horror films because they were on TV. And, I said at the very beginning, with the European horror, if it was ever on, for me was really oddly exotic and exciting, just because I came from a place that was definitely not exotic and exciting to me anyway. So I think even in the video age, it was hidden from a lot of people, because I think, particularly if you're a really hardcore horror fan, you might have accessed those things or sought them out. But I think for the sort of average fan, or for someone who just quite liked horror, or maybe even wanted to see horror, it was difficult because it just sometimes wasn't there at all. And to go back to Emily's point, DVD, post DVD, but now with streaming, that's completely changed that landscape. And it will be interesting to see what younger horror fans' relationship is with horror and what they look back on in 20 years as the films that they think, I remember watching that as a kid and it really scared me. We sneakily watched Hellraiser, on video or whatever it was, and it really scared us. Will there be other equivalents for this generation? I'm probably not answering your question really, actually, but yeah, that's what my thoughts, I guess.
Xavier.
The one example from the Spanish context that I can think of is Cannibal Man, which was in the Video Nasties list, and I think it may have stayed in the even the reduced version of the Video Nasties list. It strikes me as a great example because to this day, people often ask me when I present about Eloy de la Iglesia as a horror filmmaker, and if you look at his filmography, he made a few gothic-y melodramas at the beginning of his career, and then he made Cannibal Man, which was not intended, it was not marketed as a horror film in Spain, but then lo and behold, it gets included in the Video Nasties list. Everyone wants to watch it, everyone is consuming it as horror, and it becomes a horror classic. And I think it surprised the director as much as anybody else. So I think what that tells us is that the process of consumption of horror is just as important as its distribution, really. And that, ultimately, as Russ is saying, it will be up to us to decide what European horror in general means. That it's not just up to the distribution process; it's also about consumption and what audiences make of that product. So, maybe we should be talking about Eloy de la Iglesia as a horror filmmaker, since to some people he has been received that way.
I mean, it's interesting to have you building on that. My father-in-law's brother, I'm not sure what relation that makes him to me, but anyway, my father-in-law's brother told me that he went on a date to watch Deep Red. That was his first date with his now wife, was to watch Deep Red. But he didn't view it as a horror film. I didn't think of it in that way. It was just a film by Argento, and it was a giallo, and that was a very normal thing to consume, a mystery kind of film. And I think that's the other issue that complicates it for us in trying to understand this stuff, is that sometimes, particularly because of the video nasties in the UK at least, the things that get brought front and center as European horror are often either the more extreme examples or stranger examples or just random sometimes. But that goes back to that thing of studying European horror, of understanding that who is that person in that particular, as you just really interestingly pointed out, who is that person in the cultural context, the industrial context in which they came from. And those things are often different, and there are often dynamics beyond the control of the director in that particular case that mean the film takes on a life of its own, and then their career takes on a kind of life of its own and has a whole different trajectory. So yeah, I think it's a really, really interesting question.
Emily.
My local video shop did not have any of these films in. I just want to say that. There was, like, you would not find Deep Red in there. It was big budget Hollywood blockbusters. And like Russ said, a lot of them, until Blockbuster really took off, they were just like your local corner shop that had a video shelf in it. And, the titles turned over quite quickly because they were, again, quite expensive for them to buy, the actual videotape. So all of my kind of teen horror was American that I watched, and along with kind of early British ones. I don't even think that I watched a film with subtitles until I went to university. And then when those films filtered through to video shops, and when kind of DVD came in, they were under the European foreign film section rather than horror. So they had kind of a high art cachet that they wouldn't have had before because they were foreign. They were in, they were artificial eye. They were in that section, not the horror section. So they were kind of already treated very, very differently to other national cinemas, really. But yeah, I definitely didn't have access to that material, like when I was, before I kind of came to university and DVD distribution kicked in.
Does that answer your question, Noel?
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, I mean, clearly I was very lucky with my local video store, but we did have a lot of Argento and other Italian stuff. And I remember there was a few occasions where, my dad would bring things home that he didn't realize was Italian cinema, and there was an air of disappointment when he'd pop it in and it was dubbed and stuff like that. So yeah, we didn't always watch things intentionally that was world cinema or that was European cinema, but it was always interesting to me that a lot of these small distributors just bought up all this stuff and pushed it out there into the world, and probably not because they thought they were great films, more just because they wanted stuff to put out. So yeah, that was really interesting. Thanks, everyone.
We're nearing the end of our time. I know there's a lot of questions in the chat. I'm sorry, I don't know if we'll have time to answer them all. But I've asked one more from the chat, and then just a very quick one from myself. So Claire in the chat has asked whether you see any hope for the future of European horror. I suppose perhaps in relation to things sort of how the pandemic has shaken up horror cinemas, and perhaps how borders have been shattered and challenged in contemporary times. What do you see in the future of European horror? All right, that's an impossible question, but
HBO Europe is quite promising. The latest Alex de la Iglesia feature, 30 Coins, has been produced and distributed through it, and it seems to be capturing quite a few countries, not just Spain and Italy, but also Scandinavian countries. So I don't know what the patterns of funding are for filmmakers there, but that might be an interesting development.
Alice.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Xavier, if you know this, but I've always been interested to see, because Casa Netflix, and Netflix open up a sort of production hub in Spain, am I right? And that's a few years ago, and I was wondering if that had led to a sort of increase in Spanish film and maybe potential horror productions or not.
I must confess I had no idea.
I mean, it might have closed down again since. I just remember reading about it a couple of years ago about,
Let's hope it's more successful than the Fantastic Factory.
Yeah.
It lasted, what was it, 5 years at most. I'll look this up.
Russ.
Yeah, I think another sort of tedious academic point about things we don't know. You know, it's interesting when you look at Italian genre cinema. So there's work done by Christopher Wagstaff on spaghetti westerns where he effectively counts how many spaghetti westerns there were. Austin will correct me, but I think it was something like 450, I think he said. And he said it will take 6 months if you sat down to watch them back to back. We don't have that kind of data for European horror. And that's the thing that I think would be interesting, because in order for us to understand patterns better and to understand actually where we are at the moment in terms of production, that would be useful. Because, you know, one of the things I've started to do, and I've got a sort of project in my mind about this, is looking at film festivals, particularly genre festivals, where new horror that wants to be released is going to go and find a home, is then looking at actually where are those films? Are they European films? Are they American films? Are they beyond that? And beginning a process of actually thinking, well, what is there at the moment? Not all this stuff eventually gets distribution. And that's the other thing. If you look at festivals, you might see a lot of European horror films, and there are a number, but they don't necessarily, of course, all get picked up and go anywhere. But I think that, you know, the shift in, for good or bad, the shift with Netflix, streaming services, particularly Amazon Prime has a huge catalogue of stuff on it, you know, some of which is good. So thank you, Austin. Some of which is bad, but I think that opens up more opportunities for distribution of European horror films that are coming through, showing at festivals, getting visibility there, and then maybe being picked up. But again, this is where we need to do work. Really, we've set ourselves up here, I think, for an entire career of stuff to do.
Alice.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm kind of interested in as well is the idea of the sort of draw of Hollywood, and how there seems to be, you know, a bit of an idea that, especially within horror, that a director might make 1 or 2 films in their home country, and then the big ticket get taken over to work on a sort of big budget American production. And I think that's always quite fascinating to look and to see whether, yes, new forms, you know, sort of new avenues of funding, such as Netflix, such as Amazon, is going to counter that a little bit. Because thinking in the French context, we had this huge pull of talent over to America, sort of around from about 2007 onwards. And it never really kind of worked out for whatever reason. And that's a whole other thing we could talk about this idea of, yeah, European directors, you know, enticing American producers, and then actually the projects never work out because something doesn't quite translate. But yeah, so as I say, you had this huge pull of talent over to America, and it never really kind of took hold as much as it could have done. And so it'll be interesting to see whether that keeps on happening, whether we keep on getting that drift of kind of talent over, or whether it will stay more in Europe with these new avenues. And I think that's something that I'm kind of interested in looking at in the future.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And I'm conscious that we've hit the end of our time. I hope I can ask you one last very quick question. It is Halloween week. We've 4 nights to go until Halloween, and we've 4 experts. I was wondering if you could recommend a European horror film for us all to watch in preparation for Halloween.
I would, picking up on Christina's point earlier on, I would go probably for, it's not Halloween themed, but it's just a great, well-made horror film, which is The House with Laughing Windows by Pupi Avati, because generally people watch Italian horror films that are full of gore and aren't that great, frankly. And that's a really well-made film by a really good filmmaker. So I would recommend that.
Thank you very much. Emily.
I am thinking, because I have to accommodate a 5-year-old and a 10-year-old, so my brain straight went to kids' films. I'm just going through it, going, which ones are European? There's a film called Paper House, which is an adaptation of a book called Marianne Dreams. And I'm pretty sure it's British. And it's one of the most terrifying things I've ever seen. So I'm going to try and get hold of a copy and show it to my children this weekend. It's just really disturbing from what I remember. It is British. Thank you, Laura. Yeah, I'm going to watch it this weekend. That'll put my kids up.
Thank Thank you very much. Xavier, what's your choice?
Well, I'm just going to go with the one I mentioned before because I think it's a little scene. I would suggest Cannibal Man, a great example of a queer socialist gore splatter, Spanish style.
Thank you very much. And Alice?
And I'd say, because Halloween, you always need something that's a bit of fun. I'm not normally a fan of horror comedies, but I really love Satan with Vincent Cassel playing himself and his sister wife, but something a bit fun for Halloween.
What about you, Reece?
It's a good choice. A European horror. Well, it's always a classic for me. I always, I'm going to go back in the past. And the day before Halloween, I always watch Theatre of Blood with Vincent Price. I grew up on Vincent Price, so it holds a special place in my heart. I trust everyone's seen that, but for campy horror, I don't think you can do much better.
That's brilliant. Brilliant.
Yeah, well, thank you all very much. Thank you all for the fascinating discussion. Hopefully, you all on the audience know how to use your applaud functions and thank our brilliant speakers. Xavier Aldana Reyes, Russ Hunter, Emily Brick, and Alice Haylett Bryan. Thank you for giving up your time this evening. Thank you for a very interesting discussion. I also want to thank Laura Meek, Kate Egan, and Shelley McMurdo for having facilitated this event. Hopefully it's been very interesting. Thank you all for coming along tonight. And with it being Halloween week, I just want to remind you that on Halloween, everyone's entitled to one good scare. So I hope yours is a good one this year. Thank you all, and thank you all for coming along.
Thanks, Reece. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.